The adrenal glands are tiny little organs that sit on top of each kidney. In fetuses and neonates, the adrenal glands can be beautifully seen by ultrasound, but not so much in children or adults. So why do we bother learning about them as a sonographer? Well, the hormones that adrenal glands release regulate a lot of body functions. And when the adrenal glands malfunction, they can also cause a lot of problems. So understanding the pathophysiology of the adrenal gland will elevate your knowledge and skill set, which gives you better tools when presented with certain patient symptoms. There are also pathologies of the adrenal glands that can be seen by ultrasound, and you will want to recognize them in conjunction with patient symptoms and lab tests. Hormones. Let's talk about hormones. Hormones are released by organs found throughout the body. They take in building blocks found in the blood, create a hormone, and then send it back into the bloodstream. Organs that produce hormones are part of the endocrine system. The organs are going to talk to one another and function through feedback loops. Hormones may decrease in the body because the cells are using them up, the organ isn't producing enough of them, or the organ isn't getting the message to produce. The same is true when there's an increase in hormones. The cells in the body might not be using the hormone, the organ or a tumor on the organ is producing way too much hormone, or the organ isn't getting the message to stop production. Anatomy. I want to take a closer look at the adrenal gland and the hormones it produces, but first let's look at the microanatomy. Recall that the adrenal gland is made up of two main sections, the cortex on the outside and the medulla in the center. The cortex can be broken down into three sections. On the very outside closest to the capsule, we have the zona glomerulosa. The middle layer is the zona fasciculata, and the innermost layer closest to the medulla is called the zona reticularis. Can you think of a good way to remember this order? Maybe a mnemonic device? Maybe good for reading or grandma's fart rainbows? Nah, you get the idea. Hormone production. Each zone of the cortex and the medulla are responsible for making a specific set of hormones, and each of these hormones has a very specific function. Let's work outer to inner and start with the zona glomerulosa. The zona glomerulosa is responsible for making two hormones called aldosterone and corticosterone. The main role of these hormones are to regulate salt and water in the body, thus having an effect on blood pressure. The next and largest zone is the zona fasciculata, and it produces cortisol. Cortisol plays a massive role in the body, most importantly regulating metabolism, immune response, and stress response. Third up is the innermost layer of the cortex, the zona reticularis. The reticularis is responsible for making androgens. These present as weak precursor hormones that will become amplified as the androgens interact with the testes and ovaries, becoming testosterone and estrogen. In the center of the adrenal gland is the medulla. The medulla is responsible for making the hormones adrenaline, also known as epinephrine, and noradrenaline, also known as norepinephrine. You may know these hormones as part of the fight or flight response we get when we are in stressful situations. These hormones act similarly to one another in our bodies by increasing the heart rate, increasing blood pressure, expanding our airways, enlarging the pupils, priming muscles for action, and feeding the brain a lot of sugar so it can remain alert. So let's recap. The zona glomerulosa is responsible for aldosterone and corticosterone. The zona fasciculata is responsible for cortisol. Zona reticularis is responsible for androgens. And the medulla is responsible for creating adrenaline, which is known as epinephrine, and noradrenaline, which is also known as norepinephrine. Feedback loop. So how does the adrenal gland know to send out its hormones? Well, remember when I said that the organs talk to one another? Let's take a closer look at this using cortisol as an example. First though, let's talk about a feedback loop. Your body is always trying to stay in a happy medium. We call this homeostasis. Endocrine organs are constantly monitoring the blood for drops and increases of hormones. When a hormone or substance in the body is low, the organs talk to one another to get it back up. As it passes by that happy medium, the organs talk again to bring it back down. The feedback loop regulates hormone production, but disease can interrupt or alter the loop. When the hypothalamus in the brain recognizes that the body needs help with metabolism, immune response, or stress response, it may recognize that there isn't enough cortisol circulating in the body. So it calls or talks to the pituitary gland by releasing corticotropin-releasing hormone, known as CRH. The pituitary gland gets the message and sends out adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH. The ACTH is a message for the zona fasciculata to produce cortisol. The adrenal gland will keep producing cortisol until the hypothalamus says, "There's enough," and stops sending out CRH, to which the pituitary gland will respond by stopping the production of ACTH, and then the adrenal gland will stop the production of cortisol. Blood levels of cortisol will continue to drop until the hypothalamus recognizes that the body needs more, and the loop begins again. Pathophysiology. The loop, however, is not perfect, especially in the setting of tumors in the endocrine glands. In this example, a pituitary mass might produce ACTH no matter the input from the hypothalamus. The adrenal gland doesn't know that this is false information, so it will also produce more cortisol as long as it's getting the ACTH. A tumor, however, in the adrenal gland can also go rogue and decide it's going to produce cortisol regardless of the input that it's getting from the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. Patients with lab tests that indicate elevated or depressed hormonal levels will exhibit symptoms associated with it. For example, we know that cortisol regulates metabolism. A patient that has excessive cortisol levels due to a cortisol-producing tumor of the adrenal gland will have poor metabolism control and may be obese with uncontrolled blood sugar. In this scenario, it's actually called Cushing's syndrome. So we can test a patient's blood hormone levels to determine where the breakdown in the loop is occurring and to better determine where the disease is located. Common lab tests for the adrenal glands include ACTH, cortisol, and aldosterone. Depending on if the hormones are high or low in the blood, certain diseases can be diagnosed, like Cushing disease, Cushing's syndrome, Addison's disease, and Conn syndrome. When the blood tests indicate that the disease is more likely associated with the adrenal gland malfunction, ultrasound can be used to look for tumors or changes of the adrenal gland.